Hello and welcome to week 6 of the Stoics. So this week we're going to look at the Book of Ecclesiastes, which is maybe a controversial choice because it doesn't constitute in any sense traditional Stoic philosophy. This is a work of the Old Testament, and it's a work that isn't really setting out any kind of active inquiry into what the nature of things is. Instead, it's in many places it's a reflection on the limits of what can be known, on the limits of wisdom. And yet I want us to think seriously about the Stoic resonances. There are historical reasons for us thinking about these resonances, but there are also thematic ones as well. I want us to use Ecclesiastes to draw out something that has kind of been oblique in our course so far, which is the transience of life and how we respond to that. And I think Ecclesiastes offers us a couple of very insightful routes. Now let's just kind of bring things back to a quick overview of Stoic themes that we've encountered so far. I want to do this so that we can begin to kind of think about whether Ecclesiastes really fits into this. So if we take our minds back to a couple of weeks ago when we looked at Seneca and on the shortness of life. Now, I know there were the kind of disagreements in person about, or on Zoom, about Seneca, his hypocrisy, his nickname Super Rich Seneca, because Seneca doesn't seem to quite practice what he preaches. Now let's think just about what Seneca was trying to argue in On the Shortness of Life and how that reflects his broader Stoic thinking. He says there in one telling moment that living is the least important activity of the preoccupied man. And there is a whole emphasis in that work and in his thinking more broadly into taking stock and recognizing what really matters in life, living in the present, not dwelling too much in the past, not being too anxious about the future, to live, to not merely exist. So then for Seneca, his Stoicism is part of a wider way of life, one that is a practical way of life. It's one in which philosophy isn't about the study of words, but it's about how we live. And it involves a kind of cheerfulness, a kind of joy, serenity. He talks elsewhere that we need to return cheerfully what nature has gifted us, our social position, the people that we love, and so forth. And yet with Seneca, there is an active inquiry into things. There is a sense that we can understand nature. And remember, he writes this work, Natural Questions. This kind of differs from the resignation which really characterizes Ecclesiastes, which we'll see. Now in Marcus, we do get more resignation. We do get a sense of an emperor who is trying to remind himself to not get too caught up with anxieties about posterity and so on. In this work that he writes to himself, it's untitled, we call it the Meditations, he says, what is eternal fame? Emptiness. Then what should we work for? Only this. Now let's just stop there. Now in Ecclesiastes, eat, drink and be merry. But what does Marcus say? What should we work for? He says, only this, proper understanding, unselfish action, truthful speech. Okay, difference of Stoicism. We're going to explore these differences as we go along. But we also get in Marcus this running theme of resignation, to accept what is necessary, to accept that actions flow like water. Now, if we bring our minds back to this kind of set of Greek Stoics, and there's Epictetus in the bottom left as well, then we've seen a tradition that sees itself as kind of beginning with Socrates in the top left, and Zeno of Citium, who survives a shipwreck, comes to Athens and wants to find somebody like Socrates, to study under somebody like Socrates. He ends up studying under the Cynics, under Crates. Now Stoicism sees itself as wanting to learn from and to kind of be a successor to Socratic philosophy, because it's philosophy that's organized around a way of life. It's something that is going to achieve a greater, it's not just going to achieve rational knowledge, but it's going to elevate our souls and bring some kind of contentment, a tranquility of mind. Now this tranquility of mind is going to involve a kind of healthy detachment or non-attachment. We've also disagreed about this in our Zoom sessions. And in the words of Epictetus, it's going to involve our recognition of what is up to us, what is in our control and what is not. Marcus also had this phrase that we explored last week of developing an inner citadel. We're going to look at this with Montaigne in a few weeks' time, of a kind of a place of calm, serene detachment. Marcus has this image of kind of floating above the earth. We can imagine in a hot air balloon or maybe in a spaceship. A place of detachment where we can see things for what they are. We can therefore not get too caught up in our own political ambitions or the haze of our own short-term ambitions and anxieties, and take a view, Spinoza would say, subspecie aeternitas, from the under an aspect of eternity. Now, one of the things that I also wanted to draw out, and I mentioned this in the first week, are these kind of processes of Stoic thinking, at least as I see it. I want us to just have these in mind here, because we're then going to look at Ecclesiastes and see to what extent it fulfills or to what extent it differs from these. Now, one with self-knowledge, understanding oneself. Of course, this comes up in all sorts of different ways. It came up, if we think back to Diogenes Laertius or Cicero, in their summaries of Greek thinking, understanding what human beings are by nature. That all human beings are like all living things. They have a natural impulse, horme, affinity for their own constitution. Spinoza will call this a conatus much later. All things kind of strive to persist in their own being. Now, the Stoics push us to understand ourselves by nature as natural things. That we have this kind of striving to exist in different ways. That if we want to understand the human being, we shouldn't be too preoccupied with some kind of immaterial soul or some kind of religious ideal of how we should be. We need to understand ourselves as passionate animals, but also as rational animals who have a capacity for reason which can be developed and can be understood. Now, a second feature which hasn't really come out that much, I think to me it came out with Marcus Aurelius' compassion. Hopefully you've been able to see this there in some of our other figures. Maybe in Epictetus, maybe in Seneca. This point that we need to kind of forgive how other people piss us off. We need to forgive other people's aggressions and the way that they frustrate us, because they're like us, they're flawed like us, they're passionate like us. We need to recognise that all human beings are equal by nature, and therefore all have a kind of equal validity. We shouldn't be aghast when other people harm us. We should recognise when they're under the influence of the passions, and recognise too that we are often under the influence of the passions. Compassion, therefore, hopefully follows. Living with nature is the third one. This we've seen a lot. We might want to keep in mind here Epictetus as well, that we need to kind of therefore reprogram or kind of place our will in harmony with nature, to recognize what nature is, this interdependence, these flows and conflicts of energy, generation and destruction, and to place our will in accordance with that. Now, what does that mean, place our will? I suppose what do you think? I guess it would mean not trying to have dreams or desires that are expecting more from nature than what it can realistically fulfill, and that's why we get this big emphasis on mortality and accepting the mortality of others in Stoic thinking. That so much is beyond our control, so much is driven by fate. Adversity is inevitable. Therefore, we modify, I guess, our expectations, and we kind of pursue what really matters, which is, for our Stoics, it's a life of the mind, a life studying and, in a sense, loving nature, loving life. Now, I've presented this as a materialist philosophy. It's about looking at things that exist materially as bodies, rather than this kind of dreams of the gods and so on. There's a real emphasis on the strength of the mind, of cultivating right reason, that reason can understand the universe. We shouldn't be resigned. It isn't all absurd. It isn't all meaningless. And the final part, departing from the old forms of knowing. In this sense, I've got in mind here superstitions and so forth, Greek, Roman myths, rituals. There's an acceptance that this stuff serves a useful social purpose. But the Stoics want us to understand three things: ethics, physics and logic. That our knowledge needs to be driven to understanding what is around us rather than what is beyond us. Okay, so how are we going to fit Ecclesiastes into this tradition? The guy on the right is King Solomon, as drawn in the 19th century by Gustave Doré. Okay, well, this is our agenda. We're going to look at the text, and then we're going to try and explore the resonances afterwards. We're going to begin by just introducing the text itself and the narrator, Kohelet, sometimes spelled with a K. This is from the Hebrew word for the Book of Ecclesiastes. Kohelet is the convener. What is this text about, Ecclesiastes? Who has written it? And what are they trying to say? We're then going to drill into some of the arguments of this book. We're going to look at this kind of key thing at the very beginning, vanity. Vanity, hevel, can also be translated as breath or absurd. Why is everything vanity? Vanity of vanities. We're then going to look, and this is going to be my own kind of interest in this work, how its instructions about living with nature, which is obviously a very Stoic reading. We're going to look at the contrast that it draws between wisdom and folly, which is also a very Stoic way of looking at things. But we're going to use this to explore how Ecclesiastes challenges Stoic thinking, how it disagrees with it in lots of ways. In the final part, we're then going to explore how this work offers a practical ethics of joy, and we're also going to use this to look at alternative readings by Montaigne, by Emmanuel Levinas, even Jean Baudrillard, about what Ecclesiastes can mean for us now. Okay, alright, so let's begin by looking at this text and its narrator or narrators. So, I mean, I don't know what you thought when you saw Ecclesiastes was going to be on this course, and when I set it for you as a text. You may never have read Ecclesiastes before. You may be very familiar with it from a religious education or from religious belief and worship now. I think it's interesting because and the reason why I wanted to set the King James version is because it's very familiar, even though we haven't read it, because so many of its inflections appear in English. Sometimes they're indistinguishable from Shakespeare in different ways. Oh, there's a great quote from Doris Lessing. Doris Lessing, she writes an introduction to one edition of Ecclesiastes, and she says that this is, quote, a text that has inspired mountains of exegetics, commentaries, analyses over so many centuries and in so many languages, and you have not read one word. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but something that is just familiar with us. What are these phrases? And what I suggest is that you read Ecclesiastes, then watch this recording. Some of them will be immediately familiar. To eat, drink, and be merry, or the phrase that of having a fly in the ointment. There is a time for everything. We'll talk about the music of this in a second. To cast your bread upon the waters, and there is nothing new under the sun. This comes up a lot. Nothing new under the sun. Now, this image here is from the King James version. Now, I guess I'll give you a quotation from T.A. Perry, who writes a good book on Ecclesiastes, and maybe I'll just frame this by saying a little bit about why I put this on our course. I started reading Ecclesiastes earlier this year. I'd never looked at it before, and this is going to sound really stupid, but complete honesty is what Stoics would encourage. Like many people, I had a religious education, but I've always had a bit of a wariness of reading a religious text now. Because what do you do if you're secular? What's the value of it? How do you interpret it? How can you derive, something philosophical from it? What right have I got to read it, basically? Now Perry kind of talks about this as well, about, what do we do with something like Ecclesiastes in particular, because on one level it's kind of religious, and on another it's not really religious enough. Perry says, despite Coelho's popularity, did you ever hear it quoted at a wedding? Too gloomy. At a funeral, not gloomy enough. At a religious service, look out, it's awfully secular. At a secular gathering, too religious. There is no book of the Hebrew Bible that has aroused such deep suspicion from religious establishments. Is he not, after all, upper class and too interested in money, unsystematic, anti-activist, anti-God, perhaps even worse, not even canonical? And what of his theology? No covenant, no cult or prayers or revelation. No religion, really. I think this is a really telling point. That there isn't very much God in this, and there's actually a fair bit of suspicion about when the God appears, at the very end, to fear God and follow the commandments. Has somebody else just kind of thrown this in order to make it orthodox and palatable? On Moodle, I've kind of found some readings that look at Ecclesiastes as a work that is absurd, that is secular. I didn't quite follow that, but this is going to make for a really interesting discussion for us. What do we do? How do we read Ecclesiastes, and what's its purpose? I get this here. It is kind of translations of looking at this as a work of cynic philosophy. Why is that? What are the grounds for that? Okay. So, Ecclesiastes is a work that has this kind of, very sort of melancholy reputation. And it's interesting to kind of think of it in relation to the Book of Job. One in which is about faith and faith being tested. And this work here is about somebody who seems to have lost their faith, to have looked at everything under the sun, and to kind of felt a real sense of disquiet, of anxiety, that things don't seem to really matter. Of course, there's a really interesting context that we'll get to in a second about the book's author. So Kohelet, we'll call him the author, and we know from the misogyny that appears later in the work that it seems to definitely be a him. But traditionally, this work is ascribed to King David, not King David, no, by King Solomon, wise King Solomon, and we'll talk about Solomon in a moment. Now, just some kind of facts to keep in mind before we kind of keep going. Kohelet, narrator, its meaning is to assemble or to gather or to convene. So if you're thinking Kohelet, what does that mean? You can imagine this narrator being called the convener or the assembler, someone who is gathering a group of people in order to address them and speak to them. We kind of get this at the very end of Ecclesiastes as well, in a way that he's described as somebody as a wise man, who's come to kind of enrich the people with wisdom, with upright words. Now, Ecclesiastes itself is described as a book of wisdom. It's collected in the Old Testament, although there are some interesting kind of questions about why it is in the Old Testament, given that it's, seems to have this agnosticism about it. The author, traditionally, Solomon, son of David. Sorry for my confusion there. But then that creates an interesting interpretive challenge. Well, if it has been written by King Solomon, as many have thought throughout time, then that would mean that this is a work from the 9th century BC. But there are lots of linguistic reasons to think that it's much more recent, maybe from the 4th century, the 3rd or the 2nd, in which case it becomes a text around the same time as Greek Stoicism. Let's just look at King David for a little bit, and then we'll start thinking about the reasons why it might be from the 2nd or 3rd century. King David, what am I on about? King Solomon. Sorry, King Solomon. Right, here is Solomon. Okay, so who is Solomon, and why might he have a claim to authorship of this text? I mean, if it is from the 9th century BC, then it would be by far the oldest one we're looking at on the course. Well, Solomon rules for 40 years in the 9th century. He rules the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah. And in the Old Testament, and then subsequently in early Christianity, medieval, early modern Christianity, and in Islam, he is seen as the personification of the just and wise ruler. He is, he's described as someone who kind of only seeks wisdom from God, but God then grants him a lot of riches as well on top of this. He is the architect of the first temple in Jerusalem. I think he spends about 9 years building this, and we'll look at an image of this in a moment. And he spends even longer building his own palace. Now, Solomon is the ruler of Israel and Judah at a time where it's kind of relatively peaceful and relatively wealthy. It's kind of like an empire, a small empire, surrounded by more powerful empires. His father, the one I keep getting mixed up with, is David. I guess what's interesting is maybe a contrast that we could draw between David and Solomon. So David is described as quite flawed. At times he's violent. He's very devout. He's a very passionate figure in different ways. And Solomon, by contrast, is seen as kind of like very upright, almost kind of less passionate, I suppose. Solomon's actually David's 10th son by Bathsheba, whose previous husband Uriah the Hittite is kind of bumped off by David in order to marry. Now, Solomon's reign is kind of fairly peaceful compared to David's. During David's rule, his third son Absalom rebels, and David kind of manages to kind of retain power and so on. But under Solomon's rule, there isn't too many uprisings. It kind of starts to go downhill towards the end because Solomon is described as having too many foreign wives, and that they bring all of their foreign gods with them. And David kind of gets corrupted by kind of building temples to foreign gods, and he's said to lose God's favor as a result of this. This is an image of the first temple as it may have looked. A huge, very important structure. So Solomon, this wise ruler from the 9th century, is traditionally considered the author of a number of books in the Old Testament: the Book of Proverbs, the Song of Solomon, which is this kind of long love poem, which has a slightly mystical interpretation as well, and then the Book of Ecclesiastes. He's also linked to another book called The Wisdom of Solomon, which is an apocryphal book. It kind of doesn't quite fit in with the kind of, at least with the Protestant understanding of what should rightfully go there or not. Now, is he the author of these works? Well, it's generally considered that he probably isn't. He may have had a hand in quite a few of the Proverbs, but there are kind of linguistic features of these books which suggest that they were written probably about 500 years after the time of Solomon by someone else. And so there's this interesting question about the status of Solomon then, and what it means to take a text like Ecclesiastes and link it back to somebody in the distant past. I'll give you some linguistic reasons to think about why this isn't from the 9th century at the moment. But let's just think about the broader claims, because even in and just for kind of from here on, I'll refer to the narrator of the book as Kohelet, but I'm going to call the book itself the Book of Ecclesiastes, just so we kind of it's just so you can kind of fit it in with what you've already been reading. Now, in Ecclesiastes itself, the narrator says that he is he implies very heavily that he is Solomon. But we want to think here: why is it important for a text of wisdom to tag itself to Solomon? And that's because Solomon kind of becomes, like so much of ancient human history, becomes someone that is kind of semi-mythic, becomes mythologized, and becomes an archetype of wisdom. And therefore, to kind of present a work of wisdom, it needs to be linked back to Solomon, who may have kind of issued Proverbs and so forth and so forth. But if we kind of then think, well, who might have written it in its place? Well, because of there are features of the text which are kind of Persian in origin or Aramaic. This kind of gives us ground to kind of think that it was probably written by scribes. Scribes associated with the Jewish people, but who are involved in communicating with different nations and therefore able to kind of have an understanding of different languages. Now, this is just another one of these old drawings of Solomon or Solomon admonishing the people, but also Ecclesiastes and the vagueness between the two. Now, just in terms of, just a final reason to think about why Solomon might be the author, there's one part of 1 Kings 8 in this book of Kings is, it tells us the story of the kings of Israel, where Solomon is described as the assembler of God's people, and Kohelet is the assembler of the book of Ecclesiastes. And the author describes himself as the son of David, king in Jerusalem. But yeah, there are these kind of Persian and Aramaic influences. There are, I guess, more than that, and this is something that we'll come to in a moment. There are these kind of contradictions in the text where it seems that you get different narrators at different points. That if you get these kind of allusions to somebody who is very wealthy and who builds all these pools and palaces and has, male and female singers and so on, this seems to kind of be a real allusion to Solomon. In other places, you get this observations of people being unhappy at the rulers and whether you should oppose the king or not, and what that means. And so there are these, and then there is this kind of features in the writing where we seem to get different viewpoints. We seem to have somebody who is very skeptical in their questioning, and then we get these kind of very orthodox replies. On a very simple level, there seem to be at least 2 narrators. There is someone who kind of pops up at the beginning, at the end, and kind of says, who kind of introduces the work, and then at the end says, these are the words of the preacher. These are words to goad us. They're like nails that are passed on. But do not study too much. Fear God and keep the commandments. This is what comes up at the end. So at least in Ecclesiastes there are at least kind of 2 voices, but other scholars think maybe there are 3. That you've got our skeptical preacher, convener, Kohelet. Then you've got the editor, who's kind of makes these kind of things at the beginning and end. But then you've got other parts of Ecclesiastes which they seem to be really contradictory, because they talk about providence, and they kind of offer kind of quite traditional proverbs, and they kind of restate, traditional beliefs that, that we can trust in God and God is good, which seems to really jar against the skepticism and resignation that we get in other places. So this is, and you will have seen this is a kind of slightly contradictory and sometimes quite meandering text. Makes it difficult then to kind of say, what is the core purpose? What is the teacher doing? What is the teacher not doing? And we're going to try and reconstruct that here. Maybe I'm going to throw this out here briefly now, and then we'll kind of come back to it later. That if we kind of take seriously that there are these Aramaisms and Persian influences, I probably haven't explained this well enough yet. Why would that even matter? Well, I guess the things like Aramaic wasn't a language that would have been known to describe, say, in the 6th century BC, and Persian influences. This reflects the fact of being under the power of the Persian Empire at this point in time. The reasons why these references might be interesting, because they reflect the kind of 4th, 3rd, 2nd century. And we're going to look at this a bit later, actually, the court of one particular figure, Ptolemy IV Philopator, where there are Stoic philosophers in his court, and where somebody like Chrysippus, who's head of the Greek Stoic school and produces a huge number of works, none of which survive, where basically, if this text does come from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, then it emerges at the same time as this really healthy and influential school of Greek Stoicism, and therefore might be considered a kind of response to it, or a kind of a Jewish thinking through of some Stoic themes and then a response at the same time. Now this from the King James Version. Let's just think in this final part here before we get into the arguments, how we try and interpret this, given these problems about who narrates it and who doesn't narrate it. there's a lot of ambiguity. And maybe these contradictions are instructive, that maybe they reflect a search for meaning, a questioning, an active questioning for meaning, which necessarily results in confusion, indecision. Socrates talks about paralyzing the people that he interrogates when he's trying to expose the contradictions in their thinking. He's compared to being a stingray in this respect. Socrates achieves aporia, confusion in the people that he speaks with, and this text has a lot of aporia or kind of confusion in it too, because it reflects an effort to use reason to understand the world, but the effort ends up being disappointed, but yet the effort is made all the same. Now this relates to the question for us: is this about, as the King James Version suggests here, the vanity of worldly things? Is it a bleak statement of the absurd? Is it about how all things are vain and therefore even the effort to understand them is totally vain? Or is there actually a very powerful effort to apply reason, and that this reflects the striving of reason to understand? This reflects the value of wisdom to interrogate nature. This text goes quite far as a Stoic text, but it kind of pulls back at the final minute. And yet at the same time, it seems to kind of speak of a kind of practical philosophy and a practical joy, which might resonate with some of the Stoic things we've looked at before. Everything is beautiful in its time. Now, scholars have kind of identified a general structure to this. The bit at the beginning, the initial poem, and then the investigation into life, which takes up the first half, and then the conclusions, which take up the second. The conclusions are that we cannot find out what is good for us to do, and there is this kind of thing here that we'll talk about later. The disenchantment that comes when Kohelet discovers or realizes that right consequences don't follow right actions. And also this kind of dismay that we do not know what will come after him. Now, in this structure, it's linked to the end, but this comes up in Book 2 as well. The king, makes all of these efforts, to kind of achieve wealth and stability, but there's nothing he can do about his heirs. The poem that comes at the end, and then the epilogue: fear God and keep the commandments. Okay, now you might have also come across Ecclesiastes in this as well. Now, the birds, it's a cover of a Pete Seeger song. And maybe what's interesting about this particular part is that it takes from Ecclesiastes the joy, the love of nature, that to everything there is a season. There is this kind of generation and destruction. There is creativity. There's not just death and the absurd. There is life, and there is love, and there is joy. There is eating, drinking, and being merry. And in that sense, Ecclesiastes shouldn't be seen as simply a depressing or a glum text. There is a lot of joy here, perhaps more than we might really expect of something from the Old Testament. And as a result, how do kind of philosophical books inspire people in their lives? Well, there are a lot of tattoos of Ecclesiastes, but they tend to be from Book 3, and we'll come to this in a moment. The bit from the birds. To everything there is a season, there is time for everything, and so on and so on. There are loads of tattoos of Ecclesiastes. Okay, right. In this part, we are going to look at, in this next part, we're going to look at what Ecclesiastes has to say about vanity. Now, vanity comes up an awful lot in this, doesn't it? It's the recurring refrain throughout. Now, vanity, the Hebrew word is hevel. It has lots of different translations, and you'll kind of see this if you look and read Ecclesiastes on like a website like Bible Hub, where you basically can read one passage, but you get loads of different versions. Vanity can mean absurdism, but also what is ungraspable. We'll look at what we can grasp or not grasp a bit later. It's got an interesting Stoic resonance, actually. What is meaningless, what is incomprehensible, what is senseless. Vanity of vanities, vanity of vanities, it is all vanity. This is the running refrain throughout. So it's the most common word phrase 37 times. Usually this too is vanity. Now, just before we kind of start exploring the whole vanity thing, T.A. Perry, who I mentioned earlier, has written a great book about Ecclesiastes. He makes this argument that actually we're looking at this incorrectly. What if we were to look at the word havel and translate it differently as breath? Breath of a breath, all is a breath. We all share in one breath, one life, one kind of life force. Now this sounded quite stoic. I'll try and, I mean, I'm obviously enthusiastic about these comparisons, but I'm actually going to try and hold back here. Let's just try and keep our attention just on this text itself. So we could look at it as breath. It's interesting, isn't it? But at least in the King James Version and in the tradition that's handed down to us, it's about vanity and vanitas. You might want to think of vanitas paintings here. In St. Jerome's Vulgate Latin edition, you get these vanitas as a heading for a lot of the books of Ecclesiastes. You know, the vanity of knowledge, the vanity of pleasures, the vanity of labour or work, and so on. Now, just as vanity appears an awful lot in Ecclesiastes, so does the phrase under the sun, doesn't it? All things under the sun. It comes up a lot, loads of times. And what's interesting is that you kind of get this outlook of all things are meaningless, but it comes from this kind of view or study of nature in different ways. And a study of what lasts of our efforts under the sun. Like human beings strive for their works to remain long after we die, but that's not possible. What do we take of our labour at the end? Let's think about how this is introduced at the very beginning of Ecclesiastes. Not the very beginning, but near the beginning. What profit hath a man of all his labour which he taketh under the sun? One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. The sun also ariseth, and the sun goeth down, and hasteth to his place where he arose. The wind goeth toward the south, and turneth about unto the north. It whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to his circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. Now, vanity, breath. When we're looking at vanity, it's a kind of striving, I would say, for something to kind of be immortal or to be long lasting when nature itself is cyclical, it's circular. That these different elements are kind of moving from one place and going back to their place again. Now, maybe it's a bit heavy-handed, but we could think of a comparison here with the Greek elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and the ways in which these four elements kind of play out in the beginning. The four elements that, you know, for Anaximander and other pre-Socratics are the kind of basis of what exists. So for Kohelet, these are the kind of the elements that are kind of being born and well, a part of birth and death, part of the cycles of life. Now, under these cycles, we know what we have does not last. We take it with us, and then we enjoy what we can in the present because we cannot take anything into the next life. And one of the interesting things about Kohelet's perspective is that he doesn't really seem to believe in the next life that much, at least not in much of a conventional way. Now, this kind of looking at everything under the sun, this search for meaning, results at times in a kind of inner world weariness. This is one of the impressions that you will have got from reading this. Even from book 1, all things are full of labour. He says that the eye is not satisfied with seeing. That struggle is inevitable, that we cannot be ever fully satisfied. We're distracted, we're restless. And that we strive for novelty, but novelty always, there is nothing genuinely new about what we experience, nor is there anything genuinely that special about our perspective on things. Quote, "The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun." Now I'm using these images of Van Gogh here because I wanted to get to this one. It's Francis Bacon's study of the same figure, where it's kind of much more kind of ominous tones to it. That correlate is describing a search for meaning, which then encounters adversity, and then reflects this kind of great disappointment, this kind of turning inwards because of adversity, because the products of our labour and our efforts and our toil do not survive, vanity and vexation of spirit. And in that way, there is this kind of philosophical core to how the work begins, because it is about a search for meaning, using the mind. Quote, "And I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven." But, and maybe this is what makes it frustrating as a work of philosophy, that after this initial disappointment, there is a kind of giving up of a sort. Whereas maybe we might hope, for kind of a more active interrogation. He continues, "I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit." This phrase gets repeated quite a lot. That our efforts are always circumscribed by nature or by fate, and we cannot, we cannot overpower fate. We're always going to be driven by fate. That which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered. "And I gave my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also was vexation of spirit." Now this is presented as the kind of struggles of King Solomon to kind of understand. And we get this especially in Book 2, of kind of a life that of sensual pleasures, of wealth, of great productivity, of great power. And then the kind of disappointment that then follows from it, which then leads to the search for meaning, which then leads to this kind of sense of disappointment. "I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth it? I sought in mine heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainting mine heart with wisdom." If we just stop there briefly, there is the way that it's kind of linked to Solomon is a kind of life that's sort of balanced, of seeking sensual pleasures, but then also having an interest in wisdom at the same time. Now maybe this differs from the Greek Stoics, who would kind of see that a life of wine and mirth and folly is a world of dangerous distractions. That is not going to get us towards what Marcus described as truthful speech or to right understanding. It's interesting, isn't it, to kind of think about Solomon and Marcus as two very wise rulers. And with Solomon, all of this is just attributed and probably not real, but the ways in which this kind of disenchantment with power occurs. In Book 2, the narrator describes building houses, vineyards, pools of water. He's got male and female servants, silver and gold, men singers and women singers, lots of music, lots of pleasure. But again, the same thing, that he's frustrated, that his labours, what do they achieve at the very end? "Then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labour that I had laboured to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. And I turned myself to behold wisdom and madness and to folly." Now this idea of kind of the wonder and splendour of riches, of gold and rubies and music is a running theme in Dutch Golden Age painting. I don't want to kind of bore you with this stuff. I had quite a bit of it last week, but we get it. This is another wonderful study. That all is vanity. Now you're probably already kind of thinking here immediately that this kind of this reflects a lot of what we got in Marcus. We don't have much time. Life is short. That our thinking is gripped by powerful illusions. That we must, that kind of death, the shortness of life, weighs on us heavily. A kind of disenchantment with the body like a battered crate, as Marcus describes it. So the question then, does Kohelet think like a Stoic, even if he is not quite a Stoic? Or even if it would be inappropriate to call him a Stoic? Okay, Part 3, living with nature. Okay, well, I can't think of a better way of beginning this section with something that Kohelet very much encourages. Right, I don't know copyright wise how much more of that I could play, but so there was this kind of wonderful feature of Ecclesiastes, of this emphasis of living with nature and recognizing in the cycles of nature something that is wonderfully edifying, something that kind of reflects not just the limits of human mortality, but the very things that make life wonderful too, make other people wonderful too. Now, you might, if you're at home, you just play the birds song, the Pete Seeger version, because it's a much better telling than just my drab voice here. But let's hear it. This is from the beginning of Book 3. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time of war and a time of peace. So where parts of Ecclesiastes are characterized by this kind of melancholy, others are about about life's beauty, about everything having a time, everything having a season. God is described as having made everything beautiful in His time, and the kind of the running teaching, I suppose, of Ecclesiastes, I would say, is to rejoice and to live well within the confines of our mortality. To Spinoza has this kind of phrase to do well and be glad. You know that there's rather than kind of taking rather than drawing nihilistic conclusions about what we cannot know, instead saying to eat, drink, and be merry, to kind of love life and to love others. And we get this in all sorts of places. The Book 3 is really nice on this. Kohelet tells us that I know there is no good in them but for a man to rejoice and to do good in his life, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good. Now, maybe that's something that we haven't quite had enough in some of our other Stoics. Marcus is very cold and detached or non-attached. At the same time, Marcus has something kind of salutary to say about nature. There is a lot that's positive in Marcus about recognizing ourselves as parts of a greater whole, recognizing oneself as like a limb of a singular body, or parts, one part of a tree, and this is where this image here comes from. Now, Kohelet kind of feels despondent at what does not survive, but at the same time also kind of rejoices and relishes this nature, to learn joy in this. Now we get something like this in Seneca too, in his letters to Lucilius. He says in one place, "Do this before all else, my Lucilius, learn joy." Learn joy. Now I guess the sense of it too is that, what does it mean to learn joy? What is this? There is this kind of, just as everything has its time and its season, so we're also part of those times and seasons. So we are also kind of things that live and share in one breath, one thing that exists. Maybe it's a bit of a stretch, but we could say there's a kind of vitalism in Stoic philosophy, just as there is in places of vitalism in Ecclesiastes. You think, what does vitalism mean? It's this idea that us as existing beings, we we are alive, but life itself is something that should have metaphysical importance. Life is a kind of singular force that animates all living beings. You might think of energy or different ways. The universe is alive. Matter has a kind of life to it. We share in this one life. And if we focus too much on abstractions, if we just look at everything as kind of very cold matter in motion, as just atoms swirling around an empty universe, then we lose track of the miracle in which everything that is alive kind of shares in a kind of shares relation, shares an interdependence, relies on each other. Yes, that involves conflict. Yes, that involves adversity, but it also involves love and involves creation and creativity. Now, the German writer, poet Goethe has a nice way of putting this. Oops, not this. That's my recording screen. He says that the problem with dissecting things is we lose. Oh, sorry. He says, sorry. You have all the parts in hand. You miss just one thing: the living band. That if to understand, say, like the human hand, the movements of the human hand, what it can create, we would miss something if we just focus on its anatomical structure. We miss the living band. We miss the living force, the life that makes it. And I think we get this, something like this, a kind of a love of life in parts of Ecclesiastes. I won't oversell it because it's not quite there. Because just as all things are alive, there is also this great kind of consciousness that all things die, all things turn to dust. We also get this description that we are like beasts, men are like beasts. Again, from this really important book, Ecclesiastes, book 3. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts, even one thing befalleth them. As the one dieth, so dieth the other. Yeah, they have all one breath, so that a man have no preeminence above a beast, for all is vanity. All go unto one place, all are of the dust, and all turn to dust again. Now this is a very interesting kind of series of statements. Well, on one level, there's no anthropocentrism here. Human beings, animals, beasts are all on one level. But you might also be thinking here, how does this reflect kind of orthodox religious belief? All things go to one place, all things die. There's no suggestion at all here about the soul's immortality. I mean, there's nothing really in Ecclesiastes which would suggest that the soul is immortal. Far from it. All things turn to dust. All we can do is enjoy our brief lifespans, what is here. Our portion. The end of book 3. For that is his portion. For who shall bring him to see what shall be after him? Well, hold on a minute. Isn't that what kind of what the prophets offered, or isn't that what Scripture was meant to offer? A kind of sense of what shall be after us, a sense of what will outlive us. Instead, there was just this life, and the kind of the different pitches in which the author Kohelet kind of fuse it. Love, affection, and then despair. There is a lot of despair in this work as well. The images here are from Vesalius's anatomical drawings of the human body from the 16th century. I just think they're really interesting. On the fabric of the human body is what it's called. So what? I guess there's a wider question here about, and this goes back to the Stoics, of what living in accordance with nature and what our understanding of nature was going to grant us. Does it result in melancholia, the kind of the emotion that we might get when we look at, say, like a Vanitas painting or Memento Mori? Or maybe this is kind of a different thing. You might think it's a really unexpected. You probably weren't expecting this reference. Georges Bataille, the mid-20th century kind of French novelist, anti-philosopher. He writes a lot about death and talks about, he says, we should really look at the Irish wake or the Mexican Day of the Dead. That the spectacle of death need not just involve melancholy, it can involve kind of festivity, celebration, excess, getting out of it. The different ways in which mortality prompts responses in us. Let's just look at Seneca on this, and then Foru, and then we're going to start looking at another element of Ecclesiastes. This is from Letters to Lucilius. Seneca says, "Natural desires are limited, but those which spring from false opinion have no stopping point, for there are no limits to the false. When you're travelling on a road, there must be an end, but when astray, your wanderings are limitless. Therefore, withdraw from vain things, and when you would know whether what you seek is based on a natural or a blind desire, consider whether it can stop at any definite point. If you find after having travelled far that there is a more distant goal always in view, you may be sure that this condition is contrary to nature." So the whole Stoic adherence to living in accordance with nature, but then also not being too caught up by blind desires and that kind of coldness or suspicion of the passions, which definitely characterizes Greek Stoic thought, isn't something that you get much of in Kohelet. And that's as I really enjoy reading. I think this is quite insightful in that respect. It doesn't point to how we want human beings to live, but how human beings are. Toro, author of Walden, kind of also talks about this kind of how nature and mortality can lead to an inspired philosophy of life. He says, "Men labour under a mistake. They are employed, as it says in an old book, laying up treasures where moths and rust will corrupt and thieves will break through and steal. It is a fool's life, as they will find when they get to the end of it, if not before." So like Kohelet, kind of impersonating Solomon, where do those treasures get us? Where do the projects of, say, Simone de Beauvoir or Albert Camus get us? At the end, what are the products? What are the fruit? If fruit always rots, if fruit is digested, where does it go? Do we give up? That's the absurd and become nihilistic. Or do we find in the transience something that makes life particularly special because it is transient? These are the dilemma of what we take from Ecclesiastes. Okay, let's get into a slightly more detailed part. We're going to get a little bit more into the claims of Ecclesiastes here. Okay. So one of the memorable things from Marcus from last week was this idea of the inner citadel. That wisdom, in order to become wise, I guess, in order to adopt a wise perspective, we need to kind of cultivate a sense of detachment. But also, it's kind of a two-way process. We need to cultivate detachment in order to recognize things for what they are. But at the same time, in recognizing things for what they are, we become more detached. We become more capable of viewing things from above without being disturbed by the passions, having tranquility of mind as a result. Now, our Stoics, the running emphasis is about the kind of the praise of wisdom, and the importance of reason as the overriding faculty for interrogating life, interrogating what matters, and interrogating nature. Now, Kohelet praises wisdom quite a lot in his work, but not all the time. And that's one of the main things that makes it contradictory. There are lots of places where he's saying wisdom is great, and others where he's saying, well, wisdom is limited, wisdom is flawed. And this is where some of the work's greatest despair comes in. It's this kind of despair, not so much about the wise mind inquiring into mortality, but it's about the limits of wisdom itself. And there are various different arguments. So what I want to do is, I want us to think about the arguments for wisdom and then the arguments against. But I want you to keep in mind here the Stoic contrast, which we've had throughout. Keep in mind Epictetus, between the wise man and the fool. Epictetus talks about freedom versus slavery of the mind. Because there is a whole wisdom versus folly or madness, the wise versus the fool that's happening here. And this, I would say, would help us consider a Stoic influence here, a Stoic response to Stoicism here. Let's look at this in particular. So first, on why wisdom is a good thing. Well, Kohelet seems to think that wisdom is going to be beneficial. There's going to be profit that's going to come with it. It's going to make us stronger, and it's going to make society stronger. We get this kind of later in Ecclesiastes, in Book 7 and Book 9. Book 7, wisdom is described as something that it brings profit. Wisdom is the defense, and money is a defense, but the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom giveth life to them that have it. Wisdom gives life. But you'll also be thinking, there's that remark elsewhere where money answers everything. There's this whole ambiguity, isn't there? There's a kind of a call and response sometimes. Wisdom is said to strengthen the wise more than 10 mighty men which are in the city. So wisdom is greater than physical strength. But it's not something that we should necessarily expect much praise for. And he gives this example of Book 9 of this city that is under siege by a powerful king, and this poor wise man, comes up with some strategy to save the city, but then no one remembers him. Wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroyeth much good. So when Kohelet is reflecting on wisdom, it's on how wisdom can empower us to think, can empower us to to recognize these seasons of nature, but that it's not going to fulfill what Socrates promised. Remember, Socrates, a good man cannot be harmed. Wisdom cannot immure us from all adversity, nor can we necessarily hope that wisdom is going to be politically influential, that we will have wise rulers. Far from it. And I'm using Rodin's image of the thinker here, but I know that I use it every week, because there are the two thinkers. There is the thinker surrounded in darkness, the thinker that just looks inward, surrounded by nobody, and there is the thinker in front of the gates of hell, the thinker who thinks because of society, who kind of thinks in response to society and other people. Now, there's a lot in Ecclesiastes which is a response to the Stoic estimation of wisdom, I think. Now, this kind of fits more in the Greek Stoic view. Remember, our Greek Stoics, they're interested in nature and logic, Zeno, and then Cleanthes, and then Chrysippus. And there's this whole elevation. We saw it in the Cicero extract from week 2, that the wise person, the sage, is incorruptible, is perfect. Now, Kohelet doesn't seem to agree about that. In Book 7, he says that there is no just person who does not sin. Even the wise person will sin in some way, will do bad deeds, will be passionate. There's a sense that wisdom can be beneficial because of the way that it will help us forgive others. Again, Book 7, key one, that when we use wisdom, we can recognize that others are flawed like us. This is Book 7:22. For oftentimes also thine own heart knoweth that found myself likewise hast cursed others. All this have I proved by wisdom, I said. I will be wise, but it was far from me. Now, in our remark 2 is the sense that wisdom can yield useful insights, but they're kind of things that we can't always live by, because we're under the influence of the passions. We're overpowered by them in different ways. And this might be a useful way of thinking about how Spinoza is going to differ from the Stoics significantly in a few weeks' time. It's really going to be about the passions or the affects. That we often see the better, we know what we should do, but yet we don't act on it because we're overcome by other passions, by other desires. And it isn't enough then just to have a right understanding of nature. We need to understand our desires. We need to understand how we are pulled by hope and fear, by love and hate. The Stoics are too emotionally frugal, it would seem at times. But we are passionate animals. I think we get it inside Kohelet, and we'll see that much more systematically in Spinoza. Now, the disenchantment of Kohelet isn't so much about the limits of wisdom itself, but it's also about the consequences of wisdom. And it's something I mentioned before, but I just want to like repeat it because it is quite important. That right consequence does not follow right action. That doing a good deed doesn't often lead to a good result. That the just and the unjust, the wicked and the non-wicked, there doesn't seem to be much difference between them in terms of what happens as a result of what they do. The wicked seem to rule, justice does not seem to prevail. This kind of makes Kohelet kind of pessimistic then about wisdom. And there's a lot of places in Ecclesiastes where this comes up. Book 7 again, 15. All things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There is a just man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. This then comes back to how death also limits all of us, whether you're wise or whether you're a fool. It doesn't make much difference. Book 2, the fool and the wise are both limited by death. As it happeneth to the fool, so it happeneth even to me. And why was I then more wise? And then later, how dieth the wise of man as the fool? Therefore I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous to me. So this is where the kind of the despair or the kind of pessimism of the work come in. One place Kohelet tells us to not be too righteous, to not make ourselves over wise. That wisdom is limited. That because of this kind of deep vanity or absurdity that's around us, that kind of reflects, the human mind's outlook of nature and the world. There's this kind of giving in. There's this despair. I wanted to use this myth of Sisyphus and Camus to kind of think about this. The way that Camus talks about how when we look at human life and existence, we see a cold and uncaring universe. And how do we respond? Well, one kind of memorable part of what Camus says is it makes us suicidal. Kohelet, when Kohelet kind of sees that all things are vain, as far as he sees it, he says, therefore I went about to cause my heart to despair of all the labour which I took under the sun. And a bit later, this is from book 2. For all his days are sorrows, and his travail grief, yea, his heart taketh not rest in the night. Now, suicide, despair, is one thing that Camus discusses, but Camus also talks about taking refuge in religion, and this seems to be something that comes up a lot in Ecclesiastes throughout, not just at the very end. To trust in God, even though God seems to be very cold and distant and impersonal. To trust that we cannot have access to the answers, and that even seeking the answers is somewhat futile. Our names shall be covered in darkness. So we could almost imagine Marcus saying this. God seems to disappear in places, from book 6. For who knoweth what is good for man in this life? All the days of his vain life which he spendeth as a shadow. For who can tell a man what shall be after him under the sun? Again, the soul seems mortal, God seems distant. And therefore, what will philosophy offer us? What will this interrogation into nature offer us? For in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. Now, this is a famous line from Ecclesiastes. He that increases knowledge increases sorrow. Very reductively, we could call it ignorance is bliss, although there's no bliss here at all. It's simply to not experience pain, which is kind of like the Stoic apatheia, an absence of negative emotions. But elsewhere, and we've seen this earlier in the praise for wisdom, wisdom makes us stronger. Wisdom adds to life. Wisdom may not be praised, but wisdom kind of overall kind of benefits, and not just benefits oneself, but at the very end of Ecclesiastes, it benefits the people. But things are mortal, things are passing. And this is from Rome, I think it's the Temple of Saturn. There's another kind of strain of this thinking, which I imagine we'll end up talking about in our discussion on Monday, which is the resignation that comes with it. Quietism. Now, quietism, is, quietism kind of literally is the seeking of tranquility or peace, and that kind of quietism reflects, I guess, a lot of the therapy of what the Stoics are offering. But quietism we wouldn't see as a political evil, because it involves us not challenging injustice, not challenging violence. And there is undoubtedly a lot of this in Ecclesiastes. It kind of varies. You get places where the narrator is talking about the oppression and the suffering of the poor. Book 4. So I returned and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comfort. But just as Kohelet sees the suffering of the poor, he also counsels that it's better not to kind of react forcefully against it, to kind of to rebel against it. Also from Book 4, better is an handful of quietness than both the hands full of travail and vexation of spirit. In Book 5, he talks about if you see the oppression of the poor and the perverting of justice, then, do not marvel at the matter. For he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. There are places where the book kind of trusts in a providence that elsewhere it dismisses. We're told not to curse the king because, the king might find out, that a bird of the air shall carry the voice. Now, there could be a contextual thing to this, that rebellions were very common in this period, and they would usually be led by someone who claimed to the throne, who may not themselves be a particularly good or wise ruler, but just another ambitious son of the former king. When we think about what rebellion means in this period, it can be takeovers by different aristocratic factions, different religious factions. There certainly aren't mass democratic movements in this period whatsoever. But yeah, I'm sure we probably will feel, at least as 21st century folk looking at an ancient text, a bit of discomfort about how we would apply this stuff nowadays. We would be unsure about it. If there's going to be any change, it needs to be through gentle reform. We even get this in the Book of Proverbs, also attributed to Solomon. By long forbearing is a prince persuaded, and a soft tongue breaketh the bone. So kind of gentle persuasion. Now, of course, this reflects, when we think about quietism, it reflects what Stoicism is trying to do, which is a tranquility of mind, a kind of quietness. But we might kind of think that this kind of interrogation of nature always kind of cut short too soon in Ecclesiastes. Things on the surface may look to be vain, but why don't we use our minds to interrogate its causes? Why do we back off? Instead, Kohelet says all is vanity. Then I commended mirth, because a man hath no better thing under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry. For that shall abide with him of his labour the days of his life, which God giveth him under the sun. When I applied mine heart to know wisdom, then I beheld all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. Because though a man labour to seek it out, yet he shall not find it. Yea, farther, though a wise man think to know it, yet shall he not be able to find it. Now this obviously is a rebuke to what we're thinking about, Stoicism. These aren't Stoic conclusions whatsoever. Now let's think for a moment, and I want you to think for a moment here about to what extent Ecclesiastes resonates with Stoic themes and where it differs. I'll just give you a moment, and then I'm going to suggest some. Well, Kohelet takes the view that all of us are circumscribed by death. We're all limited by death or fate. Very similar, I suppose, to the Stoic outlook. Life is defined by continuous activity. Everything is under the sun. Everything has these seasons and cycles. There's also a kind of a feature to the writing which is kind of reminiscent of maybe Epictetus, of these rhetorical questions, of self-questioning, seeking meaning in a disenchanted world, a world without the gods, a world driven by fate. So Zeno and Chrysippus also have a lot to say about fate. They talk about We need to live like a dog that is tied to a wagon that is pulling the dog in front of him. We can either follow the wagon willingly or not. So it is with us. Remember Epictetus, we cannot control what happens to us. We can only control our opinions or our judgments. Do we not get something similar in Ecclesiastes? All is vanity. So it's about how we live with that vanity, that absurdity, that common breath. But then there are obvious differences. We've been talking about the wise and the fool. Now for Kohelet, they're equal because they were both limited by death. But our Greek Stoics definitely wouldn't agree with that. There is a huge difference between the slavery of the fool and the freedom of the wise man. Remember, the sage, the wise man, is someone who doesn't feel passions, is good, is the only person who's fit to run a country, to be in jury. There's a huge difference. And also, this is something that I didn't make a big deal out of when I did this in the recording. But for the Stoics, the Greek Stoics, whether you're a tiny bit foolish or very foolish is all the same. Any small degree of foolishness or of kind of living under the slavery of the passions, even a small bit is enough to make you a slave or a fool. Whereas I think in Ecclesiastes it's slightly more tempered. Now, our Stoics want to inquire into physics. They want to understand the fabric of the universe. But I don't think Kohelet does. He thinks it's vain to seek this out. It's beyond our comprehension. All is vanity. He talks about things being a grasping after the wind. And maybe this is an allusion to the Greek word catalepsis, which means grasping. It's the grasping of an impression caused by an object. Well, it's like it's the response in our minds. It's this powerful impression in our minds that's caused, I guess, by an object or an encounter, but not just that object, but it's how we think about that. The transformation, the kind of spark moment in our thinking. This grasping, this sudden handling. But this is trying to grasp the wind, as far as Kohelet sees it. It's not going to get us very far. So if we're going to conclude that in some ways Ecclesiastes is an anti-Stoical text, then I would encourage you then to think, well, how does that bear on your own thinking? Are you with the Stoics that we need to interrogate nature, that nature is something that we can understand, that we can get beyond surface impressions, that we can recognize something in the universe that isn't human-centered, but that doesn't mean that we need to kind of resign ourselves to just eating, drinking, and being merry? Or do you share this kind of love of life that you get from Kohelet? That when we see human life and its brevity, that doesn't kind of want us to turn away towards the contemplative life, but instead it pushes us to an active life with others. Maybe both. Let me try and sell you on the good of Ecclesiastes. So this final part, we're going to look at joy, and then we're going to round up. So eating, drinking, and being merry. This is one of the teachings here. To kind of enjoy life now, because it is brief. But there are other teachings in Ecclesiastes that are about how we live and how we should live. Remember that phrase from earlier, cast your bread upon the waters. This is about, you might think, what on earth does that mean, to chuck your bread on the water? And apparently it'll come back in many days. This is about generosity. That we should give in the expectation that, there will be a reward at some point, but it's good to give anyway. Give because we do not know what will happen tomorrow. Give because benefits may accrue. Yes, life is defined by adversity and hardship, but there is still plenty to enjoy about that. We also get this in Book 11. I think Book 11 is really useful in terms of thinking about the way of life that Ecclesiastes teaches. But if a man live many years and rejoice in them more, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they shall be many. All that cometh is vanity. There's a lot in Ecclesiastes about memory, about remembering the past and remembering childhood. The kind of mourning versus feasting. But it's contradictory, isn't it? Because there is a lot of praise and encouragement for us to feast, just as there is this kind of turn to mourning at the end. So maybe that fits into the biographical view that Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon at the end of his life, whereas, say, the Song of Solomon, which is this kind of slightly even like erotic, like love poem, it reflects Solomon in his youth. There's a lot of praise for friendship, or the two are better than one, you know, the ways that living with others strengthens us and it empowers us to live joyfully with the wife whom thou lovest all the days of the life of thy vanity. So this isn't pushing us away towards, you know, cold contemplation of the universe like Marcus, you know, floating above. This is about entering into life despite its circularity, despite its cycles and seasons, and because of it. Ecclesiastes was a work that was very important to Montaigne. There were a lot of transcriptions from the Book of Ecclesiastes in Montaigne's library. Montaigne says, quote, "Our life is composed like the harmony of the world of contrary things, also of diverse tones, sweet and harsh, sharp and flat, soft and loud. If a musician liked only one kind, what would he have to say? He must know how to use them together and blend them. And so must we do with good and evil, which are consubstantial with our life. Our being cannot subsist without such a mixture." That the good life for Montaigne is a way of life, and it's one in which it involves, you know, kind of different notes and different sounds of kind of pleasure and pain, of good and evil. That we cannot strive for some kind of life that is kind of completely cold and removed and detached, because then that wouldn't be a fully human life. We also get praise and kind of similar themes in other writers about the importance of philosophy being part of a way of life, which is a love of life, not just a way of life which is a kind of a making your peace with how life is shit. No. That living life well and enjoying life is the teaching of philosophy. Seneca says that life is a gift of the immortal gods, but living well is the gift of philosophy. To live well. Levinas says that it is in the manner in which one is present, in which one lives, that there is ethics. And we had that kind of furrow appearing earlier. About the good life isn't one that's just about material achievements, but it's a kind of a life of the mind and the soul, but living with nature, living in nature, living with others, not living separate from others. These are all important teachings of Ecclesiastes. This is where it bears this interesting kind of world-weary but still worldly influence. Coelho is described as teaching the people wisdom in this respect. He teaches them knowledge. The words of the wise are as goads. They encourage, they prompt, they challenge us. T.A. Perry, who writes this great book about Ecclesiastes, describes it as foundational of a culture that values discourse over power. And maybe that reflects the ways in which this text has these disagreements. You know, sometimes life is bleak, sometimes life is beautiful, sometimes wisdom is best, other times he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. It really varies. But maybe, here are some of these quotes, maybe one of the interesting lasting things is that if this is a philosophy of life over death, it's also one in which the soul is mortal throughout. The dead are said to not know anything. This is in Book 9. For there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave, whither thou goest. So do what we can here and now. Finally, a slightly unexpected reference. Bataille was one. Jean Baudrillard is another. In Simulacra and Simulation, this work from 1981, in which he introduces the term the hyperreal. He says that we live in a world now of consumer capitalism and mass media imagery in which there is no underlying truth or reality. All we have are these different images that reflect other images, almost like holograms, kind of virtual reality. Now, Baudrillard begins this work with a quote from Ecclesiastes, you know, that all that exists is simulacra, are these kind of surface representations. We cannot have access to true depth. Now, this kind of very nicely reflects the resignation that you do get in Ecclesiastes, but then, ironically, Baudrillard invents it. It sounds like it's Ecclesiastes, but it's not from Ecclesiastes. He just makes up this quote at the beginning of Ecclesiastes about how, like we cannot have access to the real. Anyway, the many lives of Kohelet. Okay, let's round up. I think this has been quite a long one. So, the features of Stoic thought as I present them: self-knowledge, compassion, living with nature. So, to what extent does Kohelet kind of reflect these processes, and what does he not? What I'd like us to discuss on Monday are these 3 questions. What is the purpose of this work? I know it's a hard one, but what do you think is the purpose? What is, I want to think about who the author is, or who the author might be, and what kind of effects are they trying to achieve. We'll discuss that together. Then in groups, I want us to talk about what characterizes the perspective of Kohelet. What are his ideas? How does he view nature? How does he view how we should live? And then an important one, is this a work of Stoic thinking or non-Stoic thinking? Is it a rebuke to Stoicism, or does it actually kind of offer a useful meditation on them? And then for next week, we're going to continue not looking at Stoic works. I'm sorry about this. You probably wanted a more conventional course on the Stoics, but this is what you're getting instead. We're going to look at the Dhammapada, which is a collection of sayings that are attributed to the Buddha. The Buddha, this then might make this the oldest work on our course. It's believed to have been compiled in the 3rd century BC, same time as the Greek Stoics. We're going to look not at the entire Dhammapada, although it's very short. We're going to look at the first 2/3. I also want us to use the one Mascaro translation. This is from the early 70s. It's kind of new age, okay? And people have come along later and said, hold on a minute, it's not totally accurate in terms of the Pali, but it's very readable, it's very engaging, and I've looked at a few other translations, so I'm gonna be a bad historian here and not give you the most accurate translation. I'm gonna give you one that, to my mind, gets closer to the underlying message of what the Dhammapada is trying to do. I want you to think about a few things when you read the Dhammapada. We're going to think about transience, desire, the search for meaning, and how we live, how philosophy can be a way of life, the way as it's called. Again, we're not going to call the Dhammapada a Stoic work. We're going to compare it to what we know of Stoicism. We're going to look at the resonances, and we're going to look at the differences. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.